before we get started, quick question. How many of you, I'm seeing some familiar faces here. So how many of you took our JavaScript concepts course? Small raise of hands. Couple, cool. Welcome. To all of you who did not, that is okay, not a problem at all. We will be starting kind of at the very beginning. But for those of you that took the JavaScript concepts course, you might see some of the same ideas and concepts across both Ruby and JavaScript. So I also started in Ruby and JavaScript, but that was the first backend language that I learned. So Ruby and Ruby on Rails, which is a framework. So I have an affinity for Ruby, and I enjoy writing and reading it. So I will share my screen here and we will be off to the races. Cool. So welcome. Thanks for taking some time out of your week to come learn some programming concepts with us. So we are SC Codes. Make sure that I'm selected on here. Cool. So what is SC Codes? What are we here to do? So we are a partnership with the SC Department of Commerce, and we provide free programming lessons to South Carolina residents to kind of help fill the tech gap in South Carolina. And so we do everything from people who are just interested in programming just as kind of a hobby, just want to see what it's all about. So we provide courses for them. We provide courses for people who are looking to change careers and maybe have a little bit of background in tech already and want to build on top of that. And we also provide courses for people who are upskillers, people who may already be in the tech industry and want to familiarize themselves with a new language or a new technology. And as someone who is one of those upskillers, I find SC Codes to be very useful when I'm trying to learn the basics of a new language. So what can you expect from tonight? So we will go from somewhere around 6 to somewhere around 8:30 or 9 or so, depending on how many questions there are, how fast we get through the material. And it all just kind of depends. But this will be a good amount of group lecture time. So it'll just be me droning on. But if you have any questions, please feel free to hop in at any point. Alex is in the chat, and I will also be monitoring the chat. If you just want to throw up a hand on your little avatar, we can also stop and do some Q&A. Also be stopping pretty regularly to see if there's any questions about what we've covered in the past 15-30 minutes or so. We'll be walking through some examples, maybe some examples on SC Codes itself, and then we'll also be kind of doing a tie together towards the end to kind of tie everything that we learned tonight up in a bow. This is kind of your time. So if you have any questions about Ruby, if you have any questions about the concepts that we're covering, please feel free to ask. If you have questions about another programming language or topic, I will do my best to answer those in the best manner possible. So what I expect from you, as I've said, ask some questions. Makes it just more interesting for everyone involved. And just to stay involved and be curious. So a little look at our syllabus tonight. We'll start out with the very basics. What is Ruby as a programming language? What is the history of it? Where does it come from? Then we'll start with what I like to view as kind of the atoms of the programming language, which are the variables and the assignments. And we'll move on to how we interact with those variables with data and different operations that we can do on that data. Then we can start to deal with some bigger sets of data with arrays. And then we'll get into some conditionals and blocks. And then along the way, we'll have some assessments. They are not graded, just kind of some reinforcements of our learning. About every hour or so, we'll take somewhere between a 5-10 minute break, close to the top of the hour, just so that we can, grab a little snack, grab a drink, something like that. So let's hop in. And before we actually get started on Ruby itself, let's talk about the internet. So we are all using the internet right now. We are doing a video call over the internet, and there's data being passed across a lot of wires and a lot of airwaves to get from me to you and back, essentially. Let's say that we are on our favorite social network site, whether that be Facebook or Instagram or something else. And let's say that, I'm looking at that on my computer, on my phone, and my device that I'm using that social network on is called the client. And that is what the social network is being loaded onto my device. And if I say, hey, I want to grab a picture from my friend, they just took a vacation, I will make a request to the server, and it will pass back to me some code that contains that picture. And the topics that we're going to cover tonight cover more of the back end. So the front end is how you would view and see the picture. And that is dealt with on the client side. And that is where your JavaScript, your HTML, your CSS, that comes in. And then there are a lot of other back-end programming languages. And Ruby is one of those back-end programming languages. So we are going to be dealing with the collection and the maintenance and the handling of the data, the pictures, people's user account information, their emails, things like that. So let's hop into Ruby. What is it? It is a programming language created in 1995, so it is 26 years old this year, by a man that is fondly referred to as Mats. And he is a Japanese fellow, and he is extremely smart. And Ruby kind of plays off of several other programming languages that were popular at the time, most significantly a language called Smalltalk. It is an object-oriented programming language, which means that everything in Ruby is an object. And we'll talk more about some objects later. But if you remember that as kind of a base layer for your understanding of Ruby, that will propel you to greater heights. As I mentioned, it is a back-end language. So if you see JavaScript, HTML, CSS, think front end, but Ruby is specifically a back-end language. So that means that we won't be seeing a lot of stuff in the browser when we go through this course. A lot of things will be done in our terminal. That is an application that most of you will have on your computer. And it kind of looks like if you're ever to watch like a hacker movie or something like that, it kind of looks something like this. I hate to break it to you, but the hacker movies are not very accurate. Yeah, so we'll get to do some fun stuff typing in our terminal tonight. Ruby is used by some big names in the tech industry. I don't know if it is still being used by some of these companies, but the company Twitter, I believe, started out using Ruby and Ruby on Rails. Company Shopify was a big Ruby shop, and I believe it still is. So this was a very popular language at one point in time. And the thing with software is that it sticks around for a while. And it might not be as big as it once was, but there are still companies out there that are looking for people to be experts in the programming language that their system is built in. And it takes a lot of effort and a lot of resources to move from one programming language to another. So if they can find someone who is well-versed in an older language that might be less popular now, they might pay pretty nicely to hire you on. You may have heard of Ruby on Rails, and Ruby on Rails is what we call a framework. And that is kind of a toolbox that is basically built with code, but it allows you to, as Alex Martin says, get to the fun stuff a little bit quicker. So Ruby on Rails is not Ruby, but it is based on Ruby, and it uses Ruby in the platform. And that's kind of where you would build like full-scale applications. So you can build out a database layer, a backend, obviously, and then a little bit of front end as well with Ruby on Rails. So what do backend programming languages do? And this is applicable to all backend programming languages. So you may have heard of Python, you may have heard of C# or Java. Those are all backend programming languages. And these concepts apply to several of them, most of them, honestly. But ultimately, they handle data in different ways. And there is what is called the CRUD functions. That stands for create, read, update, and delete. And these are the majority of things that you are going to be doing with data on the internet. You're either going to be creating something, you're going to be updating something, reading something, or deleting it. And I said that out of order. So create, read, update, delete. So if we think of an e-commerce site, let's say that we are selling jewelry on our e-commerce site. And we need to create a new listing for the new set of earrings that we made this last weekend. We would need to have some kind of function that creates that listing for us. And then someone's going to come to our website and they're going to click on that individual earring and they're going to say, I want to see just that earring. And that's going to be where our read function comes into play. And then we say, okay, these earrings are really popular. We need to update the price so that we make a lot more money off these. And that's where our update function comes in. So we can tell the listing, hey, we need to update X, Y, or Z piece of information on this earring. And then we sell out of the earring. So we need to delete that off of our site. And all of these things are done in the browser, but they use these backend ideas of CRUD functions to be able to handle and manipulate that data. Versions. So if you are coming from front end or JavaScript land, you don't really have to deal with versions. But if we have a smartphone with us and we have our favorite app, every now and then we get an update to that app, and it might include some new features. It might update the look of the app, or something along those lines. That is what's called a version change, and it's just the developers putting out a different version of the software. And Ruby has versions as well, and frankly, a lot of programming languages have different versions. So things get added and adjusted through these different versions. And occasionally things will be what's called deprecated. And deprecated means that there was something that used to work, but now with the new version, it no longer works. So there might be a certain way that you did your CRUD functions or read some data off of an object. And those things might change depending on these versions. So just a piece of information, something to look out for. But if we go to this website here, hop in and see all the different versions of Ruby. So we're on version 3.0 right now. And if the first number in the version number has been changed, that means that it's a big version change. We call that a major release. But if you see one of the smaller numbers changed, that is what's called a minor or patch release. But as you can see here, like Ruby 2.6 is still being maintained for security, but not much else. And then next March, it will be the end of life for Ruby version 2.6. So that means that it's a good idea if you're still using it at that point to kind of upgrade to the next level and still make sure that everything works. Go back to our slides here. Any questions so far? Fantastic. All right. So when I'm learning a new language or kind of diving into something for the first time, I like to know what tools are at my disposal. If I run into a problem, I would rather have the tool in my tool chest to be able to solve that problem to start out with. So if you are coming from JavaScript land, there is something called console log, which allows us to print something to our console. And there is the same type of idea here with puts or print. If you are not coming from JavaScript land, let's say that we are working in our code base and we don't know, what we're going to get out at a certain point or what might be available to us at a certain point in our code. We can put the keyword of puts or the keyword of print into our code and tell Ruby what we want to print out to our console. And it's a way to kind of force some kind of output from our console. So for example, let's hop in here and I'm gonna hop into something called IRB, and I will go over this in more detail in just a second. You may or may not have access to IRB. I will bump this up just to make sure that everyone can see that. All right, cool. And I'll talk more in depth about IRB in just a second. But let's say that we declare a variable and we are going to call this dragon. We're going to set it equal to the string of Harold. You do not need to understand any of that. But if I were to put the keyword of puts in here and then call my variable, that is going to print it out on my terminal right there. It's going to print out the evaluation of the variable dragon. We will go more over this in just a few minutes. Now, you might ask, what's the difference between the puts keyword and the prints keyword? So if I do, puts dragon, and then if I did print dragon, now as you can see here, it still gives me Harold, which is good, but puts it on its own separate line. Print just goes ahead and prints whatever comes after my dragon variable right next to it. So I prefer to use prints because it highlights it, makes it easier to see. But just wanted to give you some information about both of those. The next thing would be REPL.it. And what I prefer to do here is when I say, if I Google REPL Ruby, the first thing here is going to take me to the Ruby online editor. Now you can go through REPL.it and you can sign up for an account and you can get to this right here. But if you don't want to sign up for an account, just Google REPL and Ruby together, and it'll bring you to this. But this is an online IDE, which is just a code editor, and you can run your Ruby code directly in the browser right here. So as you can see here, we have our puts keyword, and we are just printing out this string of hello world, and click run, and it runs our code block and it prints out hello world. So those are some tools for you if you would like to follow along. Another great tool is going to be on SC Codes itself. Let's see if I'm logged in here. Looks like I am. So if you go to our Ruby Concepts course, you hop into one of these, you will see these code blocks right here. And some of these are slightly different, but with most of these, you should be able to just pop in here and write some Ruby code directly on our course page itself. So I'm going to say hello world, and it works very similar to REPL. Just hit run code, and it will print out what we have here on our puts. Any questions about the tools so far? Cool, fantastic. All righty. Some more tools and resources mostly. So let's say that you get stuck on a problem and you do not know how to overcome it or fix it. Google is going to be your best friend. A couple of other best friends that you should become acquainted with is going to be the Ruby documentation. So rubyapi.org is a pretty good site to get some information about Ruby. You can find a lot of things that we'll be talking about tonight. So strings and integers, arrays and hashes and symbols, all that good stuff. So you can pop in here and it will give you a lot of what you're looking for when it comes to methods and how things work and what you should expect out of different methods. Stack Overflow is kind of the Google for developers a little bit. It is a great resource. I use it multiple times a day. If I have a question about something, I can usually Google it, and Stack Overflow will be one of the first things that pops up. Or I can come in here and actually ask a question, and the community will typically answer it in a pretty quick fashion. So, most likely, if you have a question, it has probably been answered here somewhere. That is Stack Overflow at a high level. All right. Another thing is comments. Comments are helpful to a certain degree as you're going along, and I especially recommend them for new learners. When you are writing some code and you need to make a note about what is going on in your code, so that you can step away for a minute and think about something else. You can come back and you know exactly what's going on. Comments are a thing in most programming languages, I would think. But in Ruby, a comment is delineated by a hash sign or a hashtag symbol. So if you put that at the beginning of your line, you can type whatever you want after that, and then Ruby will just skip over that line when it goes to evaluate your program. So I'm actually going to say hello class here, and I'm going to run it again, and we should not see hello class in that output. So Ruby is kind of just taking that out and saying, okay, this is just for the user, or just for the code author. The command line. So I already used IRB, and IRB stands for Interactive Ruby. And it is kind of an immediate Ruby development environment. So if you have a Apple computer, Ruby comes installed on your machine. It might not be the version that you want it to be. And to be honest, I don't know if the brand new Macs come with it. If you have a Windows machine, you have the ability to download Ruby, but I don't think it comes pre-installed there. If you have a Chromebook or an iPad or a phone, I would really recommend you go to repl.it and do your Ruby programming there, because it is not possible to download Ruby onto those machines. Another good website to develop Ruby on is this IDE that was developed by Josh Nuss, I believe. But you can write some Ruby directly into the browser here. And it works directly just like IRB. All righty. Let's hop into some variables and assignments. As I said earlier, variables are kind of the atomic pieces of your code. And that is what everything else is going to be built off of. But variables are essentially just buckets or containers. They hold data. And as with most buckets, you can put pretty much anything in them. You could put water or you could put rocks in a bucket. It really doesn't matter. And then we can carry around those buckets through our code. And then we might need some water somewhere or some rock somewhere. And then we can use what's inside of those buckets. Sometimes, maybe we want to wash our car with our bucket. So we add some soap to that. And that would be more of like an operation or an assignment. But if you think of variables as kind of a bucket that you can carry around and use and reuse multiple times in your code, that's kind of the basic idea. Variables have names. And these names, it is best if they are descriptive of whatever they are assigned to. But the computer doesn't care what the name of your variable is. As long as it is named with the right naming convention, the computer will go, yep, great, that's fantastic, but it doesn't matter what it is. We use variables to, one, make our program faster, describe the information that is being housed in that variable, and then to easily manage our code so that we don't have to rewrite code multiple times. So let's hop in here and let's write some more variables. So in Ruby, the syntax for writing variables is actually very, very easy. You just have to write your variable name, and that's it. So if we're going to go back to our dragon scenario, all I would need to do is type dragon. Well, let's exit out of here. Yeah, okay, let's try this again. Okay. So Ruby sent us back an error, and it says name error, undefined local variable or method dragon for main object. This is good though, because it is saying that I don't know what dragon is, which makes sense because we haven't assigned it a value. But as we did earlier, we can assign it a value with that equal sign right there and set it equal to the string of Harold. Close up that string, and then Ruby will know what lives inside of that variable of dragon. Now, as I said before, you can name that variable anything you want. So I could say truck, and I could say I'm gonna call it a Corvette, even though a Corvette is technically a car. Ruby doesn't care. Your computer doesn't care. So if I said truck, it's gonna come back with the string of Corvette. So that's just the idea of your naming convention. You can name it anything you want. Now that being said, Ruby has some very specific instructions for what characters you can use in your name. So let's see if we have, here we go. So you can use lowercase and uppercase letters. You can use numbers in your variable, but you cannot use dashes, and you cannot use just numbers. What Ruby recommends is what's called snake case, which means that every word is separated by an underscore, and every word is either all lowercase or all uppercase. If you come from JavaScript land and you've seen what we call camel case, which is first word is all lowercase, and then the second and following words have an uppercase on their first letter. That is not typical in Ruby. Typically, you will see snake case down here. I mentioned a little bit about this, but want to cover the idea of assignment. The equal sign is assigning the right side of the equation equal to the left side. So as we saw back here in our terminal, we set the string of Harold to the variable name of Dragon. And we did that with just a single equals sign. And that's how you assign value to a variable. Here's another example that you may have seen. So we have our variable name as the first thing in the equation. Then we have our assignment operator, and then the value of whatever we are setting equal to that variable name. We're going to talk a little bit about scopes. If you get confused by this, that's okay. It's something that I struggled with for a while. Variables have different scopes, and as we write more code and as our code gets bigger and more complicated, we are going to need to use different variables at different times. Some variables, we might want them to be available to our whole code base, so that when I say dragon, I always get the string of Harold. And that's what we would call a global variable. And that global variable is going to be indicated by a $sign before the variable name. So when I'm naming my variables up here, I could go up to dragon and I say, okay, I want this available everywhere. So I'm going to say $dragon equals, and change his name to Hank. And now dragon is available everywhere. You won't be able to see a great example of this in IRB, but this will definitely be something you run into as your code gets bigger and bigger. If you have a class and you want something that's available to all instances of those class, you'll want a double @ sign. And then if you have an instance of that class that you just want available to that specific instance, you'll want a single @ sign. And then local variables are what we will be mostly dealing with tonight. And those are just available within the function, essentially, that or the code block that it is defined in. Variable scopes are a little bit out of the scope of Ruby concepts, but they are covered more in depth in our Ruby Basics course and in our Ruby on Rails course as well. We already went over the naming conventions. With Ruby and Ruby on Rails, the conventions are almost taken as truth. So conventions are just that. They're just a convention. So like if I were to name it first name up here with the camel case, it would still work and Ruby would still understand that. But the other people that would use Ruby that come after you would say that's a bad practice. Go ahead and use snake case. And that's more of a Rails ideology, but just wanted to make you aware of that. Any questions so far on variables and assignments? Yes, awesome. So there's a question in the chat about mutability. And if a variable is mutable, that means that it can be changed. And the state of it can be changed. So I think I did a little bit of an example back here, but let's exit out of this and hop back into IRB. And I'm gonna name my dragon Harold again. And then I can take that same exact variable and set it equal to Hank instead. And I am mutating this variable. So yes, variables in Ruby are mutable. Cool. I think that's most everything in chat. All righty. I will start the topic on data types and we'll see how far we get before we take a break. So you may have heard me say that we are going to set the variable dragon. We're going to set the value of a string equal to that variable name. And that is a data type. And data types are a thing across pretty much all programming languages. And there are some very standard data types that are common in a lot of them. So if you remember, everything is an object. But then as we drill down into those objects, they have different data types. So as you can see, we've got strings here, and those are delineated by either a single or double quote. I think Ruby doesn't care which one we use, just as long as they match, of course. Yep. I think by default, it's going to use the double quotation marks, but you can use either of those. So whatever's inside those parentheses, I'm sorry, those quotation marks is going to be a string. We've also got numbers, Booleans, which is just true or false, can only be true or false. Arrays, which we'll talk more about in just a minute. Something called hashes and symbols as well. So let's back up here and say, we'll just say number of dragons. So we're creating a new variable, we're setting it equal to 5. So now if I call number of dragons, we get the number 5. And we can do more things with those later, and we will dive into that. These arrays, hashes, and symbols we will cover a bit later, but those are more complex. In JavaScript, there's the idea of simple and complex data types. In Ruby, they're all just data types. Great. So as you can see there with the numbers, we can do mathematical operations on those numbers. So if I were to come back over here and let's see here, it costs a lot to, keep a pet dragon. So let's determine what our total cost is going to be. So we're going to have our price per dragon. We're going to set that equal to 100. 100 of what? I don't really know, but set equal to 100. So we can take our two variables here that we've declared. So we can take our number of, sorry everyone, I've been living in JavaScript land, so my brain wants to write it in camel case. You can take our number of dragons, and then we just use the star key, which is our multiplication operator right there. And then we can multiply that by our price per dragon. And Ruby will do that data operation, and it will give us the outcome of that. Uh-oh. Yes, I misspelled my variable name. And Ruby is nice because they sometimes have these did you mean, and they aren't great. It isn't great all the time. Sometimes it's not super smart, but every now and then it will catch like a spelling error or like a really easy error that you're like, oh yes, of course, and it saves you that whole like, what do you mean it's a syntax error type of thing. So we'll go back to our equation here, and we'll add in an S on the end of our name, and we get 5 times 100, which is 500. And this follows the PEMDAS operator idea, so you can do things with parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction. Any questions along those lines there? Cool. So let's go back here. And when we first started out, we started, doing some things with strings up here. So I'm going to declare a new variable. I'm going to call him Blue Dragon. We're going to set him equal to the string of Harold. I don't know why I'm on these H names, but we're going to go with that. Harold and Hank. So we've got a blue dragon and a red dragon. Now, what happens if I try and add these two together? Because I'm just using an operator that is available to me. I get Harold, Hank smushed together. And this is what's called concatenation. And this is unique to strings, but essentially what concatenation is it's just the operation of joining characters end to end. So if you have hello and world, you get hello world. And this is the idea that computers are very good at following instructions. They are not very good at determining intent. So if you tell it to do something, it will do that multiple times for forever on end to a certain degree. But it won't be able to determine what you actually mean by your instruction. So you might, think, okay, if I'm adding hello and world, the computer is going to add a space in there for me. It's not going to. So you have to add in that string by itself. So if I have blue and dragon, and I add in just in a single space there, now I've got those two names separated by a single space. So that's the idea of concatenation. So oftentimes when you're signing up for a new website or a new social network, they'll ask you for your first and last name. And those will probably be in two separate fields. And then later on, you might see, okay, my name is very nicely displayed on the screen, and it's put together with a space in between there. So what they are probably doing is something along the lines of this. They're taking your first name, and they're taking your last name, and then they are concatenating the two and printing it out to the front end. Cool. So as you can see here, we've come a long way already. We are already very familiar with declaring variables, giving them a name that follows snake casing. We use our assignment operator to assign it a data type. And right here we have strings, assigning it to first and last name. And then we are adding them together with just a space in the middle, and we get full names. So you guys are already programmers and you are on your way. Congratulations. All right. Any questions around anything we've covered so far? Great. We are going to take a 10-minute break, and I will see you all back at about 7:07-ish. All righty. We are going to hop back in. Alex Martin covered something that should always be covered when talking about Ruby in the chat. So he says that cool Ruby fact over break. Motz, the creator of Ruby, specifically designed the language for productivity and developer happiness. And Ruby reads almost like prose sometimes. When you go and read lines and lines of Ruby, so oftentimes you'll be able to understand, if it's written well, you'll be able to understand what Ruby is trying to do. So from the very beginning, it was built for developers and developer happiness. Thanks, Alex. We will hop back in and just go over this assignment really quick, just to get some more examples. So a reference to a local variable, again, isn't going to have any symbols in front of it. So it will just be the word, no dollar signs or @ signs there. For extra credit, this one is a global symbol, a class symbol, and variable. Global variable, class variable, instance variable. We've covered what variables are. When we're assigning the number 15 to a variable, we use the equal sign right there. And again, it is right assigning to the left side. So not left to right, that's JavaScript. And we'll get into that later. Cool. Anyone have any questions that they thought of over break? Awesome. Arrays. So just like with most systems that are widely used, you're going to have to deal with a lot of data. And your system might only be used by a couple people, but it could contain just tons and tons of data. And we need easy ways to work with that data and manipulate it and do different things to it. And that's where arrays come in. It's essentially just a list of items. They're delineated by some square brackets, but they make dealing with large amounts of data easier. Good thing to note is that they can contain any kind of data. So I'm going to exit out of here, clear that. So as we've talked about different types of data, we've talked about strings and numbers and Booleans and all that good stuff. Arrays can house any and all kinds of those data. So let's set up another, let's hop back into IRB. So I'm just going to call this variable array of items. We'll go super generic there. We're going to use my assignment operator or the assignment operator. And then we need square brackets. And if you see square brackets, that should indicate to you that inside of, well, you know what, just ignore that I said that. Square brackets in this instance are going to mean an array. So inside of this array, I can put a string of baseball and the number 42 and another array of the string of basketball. And then after that, I'm going to put, oops, close up that string. And I'm going to put the Boolean true. And then I'll close it off. And that's a valid array. And Ruby says, great, I'm going to set that equal to array of items. It's real random, but Ruby knows what to do with it. So if I were to call my variable array of items, it knows what's in there. And it's storing all of those things. So yeah, they're delineated by square brackets. Maybe more sane example is this example with fruits. So we have a list of different fruits, just a string of bananas, apples, or pears. So you might say, okay, great, we have a list of items. How do we get items out of that array? And if you come from JavaScript land, this will feel very familiar to you. But arrays are what is called zero indexed. And you can think of the index as the location of that item inside the array. And when I say zero indexed, I mean that when we start to locate items on that array, we start counting the number 0. So let's say that I wanted to get the number 42 out of here. You might hop in here and say, okay, well, this is the first item, so this is the second item, so I need the second item out of this array. So I could say array of items, and then I use my square brackets right next to that array name, and I could just give it the index of 2. But I get my array of basketball out of here. And this is where the 0 index comes into play. We actually have to start counting with 0 here. So I would say 0, 1 to get 42 out of here. So come back here and change that to 1, and I get the number 42. As you are working with arrays and going through them, you will probably make that mistake 1 to 5 times, and that's okay. You'll figure it out, and then you'll never make that mistake again, I promise. But that is the idea of the index. And you can think of the index as kind of the location of that element inside that array. And again, those square brackets are pushed right up against the name of that array. So if I were to put a space in between here, Ruby's smart enough to know what I'm talking about. That's interesting. I did not know that. But typically you will find them, those square brackets right up against the name there. That is best practice. All right, so again, we have our array of fruits here, and we can come back here and play with this a little bit. So we're declaring variable fruit, and we're setting that equal to an array with string of all this good stuff in here. Why are you yelling at me? So sometimes when you copy and paste things, as you can see here, if I were to change those quotation marks, I think those are a different kind of quotation marks that most programming languages don't really like, but I don't remember the specific name for them. All right, there we go. Now Ruby likes that. So we have our fruits array here, and let's say we want to get the string of pears out of there. Just come in here. We have our square brackets. Oftentimes it's best practice or just a good idea to go ahead and close up that opening and closing brackets so that you don't forget about it and then get an error and be like, what is going on? I don't understand this. Because it's very easy to forget to close something. So the first thing I like to do is just go ahead and open it and close it immediately, and then go back and put whatever I want inside there. So for pairs, we are going to start with 0 here. So we're going to go 0, 1, and then 2. So fruits 2, and we get pears. Cool. So we can we can put things into an initial array and we can get things out of that array. Cool, but you can do so much more. Arrays have these things called methods that are built in. And this comes with Ruby out of the box. If we go back to our Ruby documentation, I'm just going to Google Ruby docs. And rubydoc.org is a good place to start. And I'm going to be even more specific. Ruby docs array. And this will take me to everything that I could possibly want to know about Ruby arrays. And as you can see here, there is a list of methods on this left side. And there's quite a few. And I don't know what all of these mean. Mott's made this language for my happiness. So these methods are pretty self-explanatory. Honestly, a little bit better than JavaScript and some other languages. And they can do some things that JavaScript can't, that are just really nice. So if I want a random number, I would have to do I would have to use the math object in JavaScript, and I would have to do a bunch of jumping through hoops to get a single random number. Ruby has that idea where it will just kind of shuffle it. It will shuffle the numbers inside of that array. And then you can pull out the first one. So you could put random numbers between 1 through 10 in there, and then just hit shuffle and pull out the first number. And that's kind of, a random number generator right there for you. So that's kind of the idea for Ruby methods. A lot of these in other languages, you would have to jump through a lot of hoops, and these methods come baked in right out of the box. I don't know what all these methods do. You don't have to either. Some important ones to be familiar with would be, let's hop back over here to our slides here. Length is more of a property. I'm not sure if Ruby arrays have properties. I'm not sure if this is classed as a property or a method, but they have length here. So this will just tell you how many items are in the array. Very important for loops, things that we will do later. Push will add on an item to your array on the back end. Pop will remove the last item in the array, and then reverse just reverses the order of the array. So in practice, if we hop back over here and we're dealing with fruits, we can use the dot notation, which just tells the computer, hey, we're about to use a method on this array here. So we just put a period there, and then our array method. So if I just say, let's go in order here. I say dot length, it's going to say, okay, you have 3 items in that array. Length is different than index. Just remember that. So index goes from 0, 1, 2, but with length, it starts counting at 1. So 1, 2, 3 items in that array. So think of length as amount of items, index as location. Let's add another fruit onto the end of this array. So I'm going to say dot push, and then dot push requires that I have parentheses here. And inside of these parentheses is where I'm going to put the element that I'm going to add to this array. So I'm going to put in here, we've been dealing with dragons and fruit tonight. So dragon fruit sounds like the perfect thing to add on there. And as you can see, it put it right on the back end of this array. So now if I call fruits again, it has added that to my array. Let's say, you know what? I don't like dragon fruit. Let's remove it. I can call the .pop method with nothing inside those parentheses. And you'll have to look at the individual methods that you use to see if there's something required to be in those parentheses. .pop doesn't require anything, and it's just going to remove that last element. And if we look at fruits again, dragon fruit is no longer inside of our array. Fruits dot reverse is just going to change the order of things. So pears is now first, apples is now second, bananas is now third. This also changes the indexes. So if I were to call, sorry, let's clear this. If I were to call fruits, that's what it's going to look like: bananas, apples, and pears. If I call fruits with 0, I'm going to get bananas out of there. If I say fruits dot reverse, I hope this works. Okay, so I've reversed the order of that. Let's call fruits again. Okay. So this is where the idea of scope comes into play a little bit. And I'll just touch on this, but essentially what I was hoping that would happen is I would hope that fruits remained pears, apples, and bananas, but it actually reversed it back because I'm calling the initial definition of fruits. So the initial definition of fruits was bananas, apples, and pears, not pears, apples, bananas. So I was not able to persist my change here of reverse. But what I can do here is I can redeclare my variable as fruits equals fruits dot reverse. So now if I call fruits, it stays pears, apples, and bananas. So I can call fruits 0, and now I get pears instead of bananas out of there. If that didn't make sense to you, don't worry about it. I'm glad you all caught my my 42 meaning of existence joke in the chat there. Fantastic. Any questions on arrays or array methods? Awesome. Now, if you've been along for the ride on our JavaScript concepts course, this would be the part of the show where we would talk about functions, and hashes are actually, no, just ignore all of that. I'm so sorry. I led you down a path that I did not mean to. So let's talk about hashes. So arrays are great. They allow you to throw a lot of different items in there, but there's no real structure to it. And it's just kind of a list. Like if you have a to-do list, like nothing really correlates to one another. You don't really know what relationships are there or anything like that. Hashes kind of allow for more relations. You may have seen in your studies the idea of a key value pair. And this concept is very common across different programming languages. But essentially, there are two elements to a key value pair. There is a key, and then there's a value. I am so sorry. I need to plug in my laptop real quick. So I'm just going to pause real quick so we don't lose the stream. All right, my apologies. Okay, key value pairs. So there's a key, and then there's a value, and they're separated by a colon typically. And this is kind of a way to organize your thoughts, organize your data. And these are typically used in what's called objects or classes. And you might say, well, Caleb, everything's an object in Ruby. And yes, you're absolutely right. But these are used in objects in JavaScript, which is a kind of a somewhat different idea. But hashes allow you to group and organize your data and represent your data in very powerful and unique ways. So let's hop in here and write a hash. And you will have to forgive me because my Ruby is a little rusty. So let's declare a variable, call it hash. And then inside of this hash, we're going to use curly braces, I believe. And we're going to say, we're going to have a key, and then we're going to have a string of value. And this should be our hash right here. So the key is the first element inside here. And again, they do not have to be labeled key or value. They can be anything. But as you can see here, these are very unique ways of organizing data. So let's do a real world example here. So if I have a dog, that dog is going to have a name, it's going to have a breed, it's going to have a color. I believe that I have some examples here. Yeah. So if I were to describe my dog using just what we've learned so far without the hashes, I would have to set a variable for each individual element about this dog. So the dog's name would be a string of Spot. The dog breed would be a golden. The dog's color would be brownish, and so on and so forth. And then if I wanted to reference each of these elements, I would have to call that variable name. Well, there's a better way. With a hash, I can declare a variable of dog, and then I can open my curly braces here, and then I can put those elements up here inside my hash as key value pairs. So I could have a name that would be equal to Spot, put a comma in there, and then I could have a breed, and color. And now all of that information is housed in one variable, and it's kind of all combined and collected so that I don't have to guess at what that variable actually references. So it's a way of grouping and working with data. And this can be used across a variety of different things. I'm working on kind of a personal application right now that deals with a lot of cars. So if I was writing that in Ruby, I would want the make of the car, and that might be, Toyota. And then I would have the model for that car, and we've got Prius going on here, and color, and so on and so forth. So hashes are a great way to store, work with, and use data. Now, again, I've collected all this data and I've grouped it together, but how do I work with it and how do I get it out? Well, just like our methods, we're going to use the dot notation. So I'm going to clear this. We're going to call our dog variable, and then I can call any of those keys on my dog. So I can call dog.name, and that didn't work. Undefined. Why is that not working? Yes. I told you my Ruby is rusty. So instead of the dot notation, ignore that. What you would do is you use a colon, and then you type in the key name there. So I told you earlier that if you saw brackets, think arrays, but that's not always true. So if you see brackets with a colon inside of them, that is probably referring to a hash. So if I type dog with the key name there, I get spot. If I do dog with breed, I'm going to get golden, and so on and so forth. There aren't, let's look and see what kind of methods there are with Ruby hashes. So again, Ruby doc hashes. Okay, so there are a good amount of methods that you can use, just like with arrays, on Ruby hashes. So you can delete things. You can check and see if something is empty or not. And all kinds of good stuff. Let me see. Yeah, if you're familiar with the idea of classes in other object-oriented languages, this is very similar to a class in other languages. There's a question, what's the difference between hashes in Ruby and objects in JavaScript? They are practically the same thing. So even down to their syntax, honestly, is it's very similar. Yeah, good question there. Trying to think. Interesting. I think, just try something here. Fascinating. So I believe that there is a way for you to find the key by using the same notation with the brackets. But I am not remembering it at this point in time. Let's hop back to our slides. So the big things for hashes to remember are curly brackets, and then this key value pair separated by commas. Those are very indicative of a hash. And then to pull it out, you'll need square brackets and then a colon with that key to get the value out of there. Any questions surrounding hashes? I know that was a little iffy. Alex had just an awesome comment in the chat here. So he said, JavaScript objects support dot notation and are a little more flexible, while Ruby hashes require you to use array notation to access values at a particular key and require you to use the right key format, string versus a symbol. So you might say, like, I have never seen a colon with essentially what looks like a variable name there. And that is what's called a symbol. It's a unique data type that's not found in JavaScript. Ruby symbol. Let's see what we find here. Most basic Ruby object you can create. But essentially it's just an identifier. Let's see what. We cover in our course. They're not really used super ubiquitously. Okay. Now, if you come from JavaScript land and you are familiar with the concept of functions, blocks are the equivalent of functions in Ruby. They are just essentially just blocks of code that, when given different inputs, they will always do the same data operations on those inputs. You might get different values out of them, but they'll always do the same operations to those inputs. It's essentially just an anonymous function and a grouping or a chunk of code. We'll go over this a little bit later, but oftentimes they will contain like an iteration or a conditional where they will check if something is true or not, or they will do something multiple times and kind of run through an array or a hash to determine, different data operations on those things. Pretty much the only things you need for blocks of code are the keywords do and end. We haven't really run into a lot of what we call reserved words with Ruby yet, but these are two reserved words in Ruby, just the word do and the word end. And they just signal to the program that, hey, we're going to run a block here. So you can't, I don't think you can, yeah. If I were to try to set a variable name to the word do, pretty sure Ruby's going to yell at me. Yep, so that's a syntax error, and it's saying, do is reserved for something else. But if I were to write a block of code here, I would need just do and end, and then obviously something inside there. So I don't know if I put I don't think I put an example in here of a block, so let's go find one. So we'll just Google Ruby block example. Why? Sorry, everyone. Here we go. Awesome. So as you can see right here, we have the name of the block, just like our variables and arrays. And then we have our do keyword. And inside of here, we will do some kind of data operations. And then once we're done, we just need that ending keyword. And that's about it. That's your block for you. Oftentimes you will see parameters being passed into this block. And in JavaScript, those would be housed inside of parentheses. In Ruby land, they are housed inside of what we call pipes. And that is the key directly below your delete key. So if you press Shift and that key, you will get a pipe. And you can pass multiple parameters into those pipes. If we go back to our block example here, we have an iteration that we're going to cover in a second, but we have an array of elements here, and then we're calling a method on that element, and it's the .each method, and yeah, then we're just going to start a block, start a function essentially, and our parameters are going to be each of these elements, and it's going to be represented by the letter N. And all we're going to do for each of these elements is we're just going to print out the letter N. So if we were to copy this and bring it back over to IRB, in my example, okay. Now, if I were to call example, why are you doing that? Well, it worked up here. And all it does here is it just prints out each of these elements individually. So it's a function, and we can pass in anything to these. So we can pass in the string of name and C codes. You can run it again, and it does the exact same thing with different elements. Cool. Any questions on blocks? Okay. I think now is a pretty good time for a break. So we will be back at 7:56-ish. If you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, or I will be around. All righty, everyone. So I'm going to go back over a couple more examples of hashes, and we will see some more blocks. Just to make sure that we've got that down. I feel like my explanation of them was slightly lacking. So here's some great examples of hashes in the coursework. So as you can see here, we've got the name of our hash, which is Grace Hopper. She was one of the kind of founders of modern day computer science. She was a huge force in the industry in the early 1900s. But we have our curly braces here, and then we've got our key value pairs inside of here. So we've got her full name with that colon, and then a string separated by comma. And we've got our next one, and we've actually got some arrays of strings in here under occupations and achievements. So if we wanted to print out her achievements, what we would do is we would use our colon and then the name of the key. So we would just do achievements like that, run our code, and we get her list of achievements right there. And we can change this up to pretty much anything. Oops. Okay. So this is valid, but it just wasn't what the code block was looking for. So even though it looks like an error, it didn't really error. Cool. And then occupations. Yeah, nice. Here's another example of that that dog hash there. So it's got Finn as the name, the breed, the age, all kinds of good stuff. And then you can pull those out with just colon and then the key name, and you'll get the value out of that key pair. I'm sorry, key value pair. Anyone have any questions that they thought of during the break? Cool. Alex shared that sometimes Ruby is thought of as a slower language, but GitHub, which is kind of one of the biggest code repository storage centers, it uses Ruby on Rails, and they have Alex says 50,000 requests per second. So even though it seems slow, it's a very powerful language. All right. Let's hop back here to some blocks and iteration. So we've already seen an example of iteration when we went over that .each example. And iteration is a concept that, again, is prevalent in a lot of different programming languages. But essentially what iteration means is we're going to do the same thing to a set of data. So each individual piece in that set of data is going to have the same thing happen to it. And iteration in Ruby, you will often find the keywords each, find, or map using those iteration. So as you can see here, we've got an array of 1, 2, and 3. And for each of those elements, we're going to do something to each of those elements. And so each of those elements is going to be represented by our parameter, which is going to be x. So this is just kind of a placeholder or a stand-in for each of the elements inside this array. So we would do 1 plus 1, and then we would do 2 plus 1, and then 3 plus 1, so on and so forth. So if we pull this into IRB, what we should get is 2, 3, 4. And we get 2, 3, and 4. So that's an example of iteration. That's a very simple example of iteration. Sometimes you'll even have iterations housed within iterations, and that can get super confusing and really complex really easily. Yep, I think whatever that. Yeah, and just like we talked about that block format with the do and the end, you need those with iteration. Those will be important. Here's another example of that, where take an array of strings, call .each on it, and then we have our block, and we have our color as our parameter. And again, this parameter name can be anything you want, but it's good to be descriptive of whatever the element is that we're, interacting with. So then we print out a string that is just current color, and then we tack on that color to the end of that. Cool. So that is iteration. One of the last things is going to be conditionals. So if you've ever seen like a family tree of sorts, you start with maybe the top family at the top, and then they have 3 sets of kids, and then those kids have 3 sets of kids, and it just kind of spiders out into this tree-like format. Conditionals are kind of code's example of a family tree. You're kind of going to have different paths that you can go down. So if a user is logged into your site, maybe they should be taken straight to their profile page. Or if, I don't know, if they are friends with somebody on Facebook, then they should be taken to this separate page over here. Conditionals are ubiquitous in coding. And in Ruby, you will see the if statements. And if statements are similar to blocks in that they start with if, just like blocks start with do, and they end with the keyword of end. So if is a reserved word in Ruby as well. So if I were to try and name my variable if, interesting. I were just going to try and call if at this point. Oh, it thinks that I'm in a block right there. But essentially, if statements evaluate whether something is true or not. So you could say, if my age is over 21, then do something. If it's not, then maybe we don't go down that path. But as you can see here, we have our if keyword, and then we have something that if is going to evaluate. So if X is less than 10, then we're going to do something inside this block. And then we just call end to signal to Ruby that we're done with this if statement. So here we're saying X is equal to 8. So if 8 is less than 10, then we're going to print something out here. So let's run this code, and 8 is less than 10. Now let's make this not true. So we're going to say if 11 is less than 10, then we're gonna print something out here. So we shouldn't see anything in our terminal. Evaluation complete, nothing printed. So that's a really simple if statement. Oftentimes, you'll want to add another branch onto your decision tree here. So if X is greater than 10, we want to do something else to it. So here it's the exact same thing. X is less than 10. Otherwise, we're going to say X is greater than or equal to 10. And I'll go over that little syntax right there in just a second. But it's we print out 11 is greater than or equal to 10, which tracks 9 is less than 10. Pretty simple. This is what's called a string literal. And essentially what you're doing is you are just saying, evaluate whatever that variable is and print it out inside this string. So if I said X is equal to, 1234. It's going to print out 1234 inside of here. JavaScript has something very similar that looks like that. But in Ruby, you just use the hash sign. So 1200 is greater than or equal to 10, which tracks and makes sense. Now, sometimes you might want to say like, okay, we're checking if something is greater than, checking if something is less than 10, but what if it's equal to 10? Well, we can use another reserved word, which is called else if. And this just gives us essentially another if block. So we can say if X is equal to 10, puts, we'll say, okay. So if we run this again, we still get the same answer. But if we say, oops, if 10 is equal to 10, that's how we create another another branch on our tree. And we can add just a bunch of these if we really wanted to. And we could, do one for every single number if we really wanted to. Be really ugly, but we could do it. So here's an exercise where we're actually using multiple parameters inside this iteration block. So we're doing a lot of stuff here. So we have a hash up here that has a key value pair where the key is the student's name and the value is their grade. Then we're taking that hash and we are doing some iterating over it. And we're going to put all of this in a block. And then we have our parameters. So name references the key and grade references the value. So if you think of these as what we're iterating over, it helps, in my opinion, where you kind of think of each of these things in parentheses as the elements that we're going to be dealing with here. So if we come in here, and so each of these students is going to be split up into a name and a grade. So Maya and 10. So if that grade is less than 9, we are going to say Maya is in middle school. it's not. So we should say Maya is in high school, and so on and so forth. I'm going to remove these. I don't think that's going to run. We're going to print this out. So Maya is in high school, Audrey's in middle school, Manny is in high school, Jess is in high school, Colleen is in middle school. So that's kind of a combination of a lot of things that we've been doing so far. Here's an exercise that we can work through. So we have a variable here called dogs, and it's actually set equal to an array of hashes, which when I was first trying to figure this out, that bit me. It got me. So you have to think of, okay, how do we deal with arrays first and then pull those hashes outside of there? So what does it ask us for? Help Audrey's doggy daycare sort today's dogs into their correct playrooms. Dogs over 50 pounds go in the big dog room, while dogs 50 pounds and under go into the small dog room. Okay. So we've got all the weights here, and then we are going to print that stuff out. So we're going to do a couple different things here. So we're saying dogs.each. So each of these hashes is going to be iterated over. And those hashes are represented by the word dog. So we have our if block here. We can say if dog, and then we're going to use our array notation, our bracket notation. And we're going to pull out the weight from those dogs. We're going to say if it is greater than 50, and we're going to say dog bracket notation name goes in the big dog room. Otherwise, they go in the small dog room. So let's see if this runs. And it does run, and we got green, which is good. So this will just split them up dependent on their weight into either the big dog room or the small dog room. Does everyone understand how I got there? Unfortunately, I can't minimize that. Cool. I was going to go over one other example. This will do a little bit more along the lines of conditionals, but we're going to write a small function here. And our function is going to be called rental car cost. It's going to take the parameter of days. I'm going to bump this up for you. Sorry. So essentially what this problem is asking us for is it's saying, you're renting a car and there's going to be a base cost for every day that you rent that car. Now, if you rent it for a certain amount of days, we might give you a discount. I believe if you rent it for 3 to 6 days, you get a $20 discount. If you rent it for more than 7 days, you get a $50 discount. So we are going to write that function. So first off, I'm going to define my cost per day. And that was $40, I believe. Okay, so pretty simple variable, cost per day, and set it equal to 40. Days is going to be what we pass in as our parameter. And I'm going to create another variable, and I'm just going to call it total cost. I'm going to set that equal to the number of days times 40. So no matter what, they're going to be charged the base cost times the number of days. That kind of makes sense. So we're going to test this against some of our sample tests down here. And one of them passed, but a lot of the other ones didn't. And that one test passing was, if you rent the car for 1 day, the total cost should be $40. That makes sense. Another unique thing about Ruby that I forgot to mention was inside of our functions and our blocks, the last line before the end keyword is what's returned. So if you come from JavaScript and you're looking for that return keyword, there is no return keyword in Ruby. Well, it's not necessary. There is a return keyword, but it's not necessary for something to be returned. That has tripped me up before. I'm like, why is this returning a random value? And that's because it was the last line in the function. Okay, so we got one test passing. Cool, but it's not covering all of our cases here. So now we need to get into kind of our decision tree or our conditionals tree. So I want my if keyword, and then just for good measure, I'm going to throw in my end keyword just so that I don't forget later. So if the number of days is greater than 3, actually, if it's greater than 2, then I want to give them a discount. So I'm going to say, I'm going to redefine total cost. Say total cost minus 20. Now, what I need to do down here is, now that that's not the last line in my function, I need to call it again down here so that it's the item that's returned. So if they rent the car for more than 2 days, we're going to give them a $20 discount, and that's going to be their total cost. We'll test that. Now we have a couple more tests passing. But someone rented the car for 10 days down here, and they need more of a discount than what we gave them. So we need to add some more things to this element, or this conditional tree here. So I'm going to say else if they rented it for more than 7 days, then I want to do something else. I'm going to redefine this variable again. Give them a $50 discount. So hopefully that should fix our problem. And it doesn't. And the problem is that I need to add some more barriers on my range here, because essentially this Ruby code is running through and it's saying, okay, if 10 is greater than 2, we're going to give them a $20 discount. And Ruby kind of dusts off its hands and it goes, I'm done. I'm going to return total cost down here at the bottom. And it just doesn't even look at this else if block. So what I want to do here is I want to add on another conditional. I'm going to use the and keyword. So whatever happens here, and then whatever happens after this 2 ampersands is going to be the evaluation that happens on my if statement. So if days is greater than 2 and also less than 8. You know what? I'm just going to say less than or equal to 7, give them a $20 discount. If it's over 7, give them a $50 discount. So we'll test that. And we have all of our tests passing. Our client is super happy with us, and they have given their rental customers a great experience. Any questions on what I did there? Cool. All right, well, that is Ruby concepts for you. So congratulations on completing that. Well done. Thanks for sticking with me, for being guinea pigs for the first Ruby concepts course. We'd like to leave you with other resources going forward. If you've really liked Ruby, we have other SE Codes courses on our platform to for you to take the next step. If you want to review the concepts that we've gone over tonight, the Ruby concepts course is what we went over the past couple hours. If you're ready to take the next step, the Ruby basics course is for you. That'll be a little bit more involved, take you a little bit longer. And then finally, we have our Ruby applications course, Ruby on Rails applications course. And that is where you are ready to build out your website and your application and make the next GitHub, probably. So other Ruby courses on SE Codes. You heard me talk a lot about JavaScript and you're interested in that. We also have JavaScript courses on our platform. I've gone through the Code Academy Ruby course. That is a good one to go over. And then if you are stuck or want to talk to other Ruby developers or developers of any kind, please join our Slack channel. That is the place to get connected, get help on your projects or with your resume, or just chat with people. A great place to meet other developers. And Alex threw a link in the chat there. Thanks, Alex. Thanks for coming out and for your patience tonight. Thanks to Alex for hopping in the chat and giving us awesome feedback during our breaks. I will stick around for any questions that you all have, but that is it from us tonight. Thanks for coming out.